Hello, my name is Sue Linderman. I'm pleased to be back with you for part 2 of our 6-week exploration of some lesser known aspects of our country's history. Our purpose in this class series is to enhance our understanding of racism in America by exploring the history of our country that we didn't learn in school. Much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear or hold are a direct consequence of intentional economic and public policy. Understanding this history gives us a foundation for action to address the profound inequities that exist in our society today. So let's continue. First, to recap video class number 1, the institution of slavery created and sustained an underclass of people in the colonies and in our country. And the myth of racial inferiority was never addressed, even when slavery was dismantled. And so its reverberations echo through our country today. The economic imperative of slavery made it essential to the well-being of the colonies and then the states. Ultimately, the Civil War was fought to maintain slavery and the dominance of the white slaveholders over their Black workers. There was a ray of hope for a more perfect union in Reconstruction, but it quickly disappeared when federal troops were withdrawn and the Southern leadership was restored. Because that Southern leadership was founded on white supremacy and the presence and power of whites in our society. And really, in many ways, defeat in the war intensified the drive to resubjugate those who had been held as slaves. So we talked in our first class about the 13th Amendment and that there was a loophole, because the 13th Amendment, of course, was the one that freed the slaves. The text, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So, with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, the Southern states became quite creative and passed laws that became known as Black Codes. This action began, as we will see is frequently the case, in the state of Mississippi, spread to South Carolina, and then beyond. The Black Codes were laws, special laws, that applied only to Blacks. So some of these laws were that vagrants could be arrested, and you were a vagrant if you were stopped on the street and could not show proof that you were employed. If you didn't step off the street when a white person was passing in the other direction, if you as a Black male stood too close to a white woman, any form of use of liquor, possession of a firearm, you could be arrested. And once arrested, you really were at the mercy of the state. And so these Black Code laws led to the mass arrest and incarceration of Blacks, mainly Black men. And as it turned out, it was those former Confederate soldiers who were the police and the judges who acted on the arrests of violators of the Black Codes. And so the criminal justice system would become the central institution for sustaining racial domination and hierarchy. As Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative has said, slavery didn't end with the Civil War, it evolved. And so these Black men who were arrested on violations that only applied to Blacks were incarcerated, and then their labor was sold by the state to commercial enterprises, to plantation owners. And the proceeds, the income received from the leasing of these convicts was paid directly to the states. So in 1883, 10% of Alabama's state revenue came from leasing convicts. And by 1898, when the practice ended in most places, 73% of Alabama's state revenue came from leasing convicts. And that year, 25% of the leased convicts in the whole of the South died. Because if you think about it, if you were a plantation owner or a Southern owner of slaves prior to the Civil War, if a slave was mistreated and died, you had to go find another one. You had to buy another one. You had to go to an auction. You had to take some action to replace that slave. And so you had a vested interest in their remaining healthy. But when we're talking about a leased convict, one of them dies, just get in touch with the state and tell them to send you another. And that's exactly what happened. So in 1898, most private leasing ended, but public chain gangs took their place. And so Blacks who continued to be arrested under the terms of the Black Code laws were still the property of the state, and still the state was entitled to their labor, but now it was chain gangs doing public works projects. And even more significant, this process of convict leasing intensified the stereotype of the dangerous criminal Black male. I don't know how many of you ever drove through the South. I can remember being a kid, being 12 and going to Florida with my parents for the first time and passing chain gangs along the side of the road. I don't think you see them like that, at least not as much today, although places like Parchman Farms still continue to basically utilize chain gangs of prisoners to do work for the state. So we move on beyond the Black codes to what is known as the Jim Crow era. And this indeed is part of slavery by another name. It was made the law of the land by the Supreme Court decision in the case Plessy v. Ferguson. And that decision institutionalized segregation and disenfranchisement, really the American system of apartheid that continued from 1896 until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Separate but equal, the law of the land legalized segregation. And of course, as you can imagine or understand, separate for sure, equal, not so much. So in that ruling, Homer Plessy had taken a train and he sat in a whites only compartment, and he did it on purpose to test the law. He was actually 1/8 Black, but of course, there is also in parts of American jurisprudence the one drop law, that one drop of Black blood makes you Black. So as a 1/8 Black American, he fit the standard, the norm, the stereotype. So in its ruling, the court said that, well, segregated rail cars are not necessarily inferior, so that's a fallacy to the argument. There's nothing that says that separate cars are inferior, except of course, we know that they were and they are, and it was part of the intention. So how did things proceed from there? You have legalized segregation throughout the South and in parts of the North as well. But that Plessy v. Ferguson decision was not enough for the Southern states. And so in 1890, Mississippi passed, well, actually, they called for a constitutional convention for the state. And the intention was to enact a new state constitution. It featured elements of regulation that dealt with voting rights. It said that potential voters in Mississippi had to have been residents for 2 years. They had to pay an annual poll tax. And in fact, the assessment of that poll tax could be grandfathered back to the end of the Civil War, creating a financial burden that Black citizens were simply unable to meet. And that Blacks were required, well, actually all citizens were required to pass a literacy test, but the nature of the test administered to Blacks was significantly different than that administered to whites. In fact, the Constitutional Convention specifically wrote into their constitution several intentionally inscrutable, incomprehensible segments, and those were the ones that they would ask Black citizens to read and interpret. White citizens seeking to register to vote would be asked to read a simple sentence and say what it meant. And in all cases, it was white poll workers who had the wherewithal and the ability to say whether a prospective voter had passed the test or not. Now, none of this was done in the shadows. James Vardaman, a Democrat who would go on to become governor and then a United States Senator from Mississippi, was one of the new Constitution's framers. And he said, quote, "There is no use to equivocate or lie about the matter. Mississippi's Constitutional Convention of 1890 was held for no other purpose than to eliminate the nigger from politics. Let the world know it, just as it is." And the Mississippi Plan was subsequently adopted by every other Southern state. Not to be outdone, Louisiana called its own constitutional convention in 1898, and its purpose was explicitly to disenfranchise African Americans. A committee chairman at the convention said its purpose was, quote, "to establish the supremacy of the white race." After its adoption, the number of Black voters in Louisiana, which had been more than 130,000 at the time of the convention, dropped to 1,342 by 1904. And so by 1910, all Southern states were excluding Blacks from voting. Now, being excluded from voting, not being on the voter registration rolls, meant that you couldn't serve on a jury. And so that had huge implications for the criminal justice system in the South. Who was charged, who was prosecuted, who was found guilty. The fact that Blacks couldn't vote and that Black representation was non-existent meant that decisions made by state legislatures in terms of the allocation of public resources for schools and other services were unilaterally directed toward the white population and not toward Blacks. And so these Jim Crow laws that so profoundly disenfranchised and discriminated against Black Americans remained in effect from 1890 to 1964, 3/4 of a century of these horrifically inequitable laws. And how were they enforced? Well, one of the major tools at the disposition of whites in the South were acts of terrorism. As I mentioned in our first class, the Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865. Its initial stated goal was amusement. Hooded men riding horses into Black communities was amusing to some. But as time went on, the Ku Klux Klan actually became a paramilitary arm of Southern governments, and it focused on intimidation, property destruction, assault, and murder. In 1871, Congress passed the Klan Act, and the KKK largely faded from view. It was eventually, its existence was declared unconstitutional in 1882, but not before the Colfax Massacre in 1873. I'm going to leave that to you to do some research, to look up the Colfax Massacre. But the KKK was resurrected after World War I, in the case of returning Black GIs, and also an arm of the anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic movement in the United States. And then again, as the civil rights movement began to take effect in the 1950s, the KKK began a series of high-profile killings. And in all of these incarnations, the perpetrators of this violence were unprosecuted more than 99% of the time, or if prosecuted, acquitted by all white juries. So we're going to turn our attention to an aspect of our terrorist history known as terror lynchings. Now, I don't know about you, but at one point in time, my thought of a lynching was there's a Black man in jail, the criminal justice system didn't convict him, or maybe it was taking too long for a trial. And so a bunch of white guys would drag this guy out of jail, throw a rope over the limb of a tree, and hang him. And that was a lynching. Well, that did happen, but that's not the aspect of our history that we're talking about here. In the period from 1877 to 1950, the Equal Justice Initiative has documented more than 4,000 terror lynchings in 12 Southern states and more than 300 in 7 non-Southern states. It's been said that the last terror lynching was recorded in 1952. That may give us something to think about in a few minutes. The purpose of these lynchings was intimidation and control, and a demonstration that the white population perpetrating these murders were operating with virtually complete immunity. The features of these terror lynchings, many of them were terror spectacles, the actions that were taken. There would be large crowds of white people, often numbering in the thousands. They would gather to witness pre-planned heinous killings that featured prolonged torture, mutilation, dismemberment, and/or burning. And then the bodies would be deposited in the Black communities as a warning. Here are some images. On the left, the sepia-toned image is actually a postcard. It includes a photo of Jesse Washington, who, as you can see, his body was partially dismembered. He was hanged and burned. When these terror spectacle lynchings were scheduled, often professional photographers would show up to take these pictures and create postcards that people who attended could use to send to their friends and relatives who were unable to be present. This particular postcard says, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left with a cross over it. Your son, Joe." In the center, you see a picture of a young girl staring at a man who has been lynched in front of her. On the right, you see a body being burned. Sometimes these bodies were burned while the individual was still alive, sometimes later. And you see the almost festive party atmosphere at the bottom of people watching there were actually 3 bodies in that uncropped picture. But people brought picnics. They brought children. It was a day out. It was a celebration as these Black citizens were gruesomely murdered and often dismembered so that body parts could be distributed as souvenirs. In the case of John Hartfield, John was a Black man who lived in the town of Ellisville, Mississippi, population of just under 1,000. He fell in love with a white woman in the town, and they carried on a relationship for some time. But with the lynchings and other terror spectacles taking place across the South, and with the Great Migration, which was occurring where Blacks left the South for economic opportunity in the North, and we will talk more about that later, John Hartfield went to East St. Louis to get a job and to save some money so that he could come back and find the woman he loved and take her with him up to East St. Louis. Well, word got out that John was returning to town, and so a group was waiting for him. When he crossed the town line, he was shot by police. And then he was taken to a nearby doctor's office where the police asked that the doctor keep John alive long enough for him to be lynched. And so you see the newspaper headline, "John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 o'clock this afternoon." Now at the top, it says 3,000 will burn Negro, but in reality, more than 10,000 people showed up for this spectacle. A subheading, "Negro jerky and sullen as burning hour nears." Imagine. And under the John Hartfield headline, it says, "Governor Bilbo of Mississippi says he is powerless to prevent it. Thousands of people are flocking into Ellisville to attend the event. Sheriff and authorities are powerless to prevent it." So think about the relationship between Black citizens and the white power structure and the protection that laws are supposed to provide citizens. Well, not so much. So John Hartfield was hung. 2,000 bullets were fired into his body. One of them severed the rope that was hanging him. Prior to that, body parts had been cut off and distributed as souvenirs, and when his corpse hit the ground, it was set on fire. Afterward, it was dragged to the black part of town and left in the square for all to see, just in case there was any question about your safety or security as a Black person if you were insolent enough to step out of line. 99% of the perpetrators of these lynchings escaped punishment. There have been 200 attempts at a federal anti-lynching law since then. The most recent attempt failed yet again earlier this year. And we will talk more about that when we get to a later class in this series. And so, according to the Equal Justice Initiative, 1952 was the last year without a recorded lynching. But you might ask yourself, we might ask ourselves, if that is in fact true. So all of this terror, even to this day, amplifies the legacy of control and the legacy of immunity to the perpetrators of these murders. And interestingly, in those counties in the United States where the greatest number of terror spectacle lynchings occurred between 1877 and 1950, to this day, voter registration levels among Black citizens averages 30% less than the white population. The history, the legacy, the lore, the cautions passed along hold a powerful effect even today. And so, for many reasons, the Great Migration of African Americans began. This was a period of time when 6 million Americans left the South between 1916 and 1970. They left because of the terror. They left because of lack of economic opportunity. They left because they were sharecroppers who had no way to ever get ahead because the rules kept changing and the costs kept increasing. They saw that there was more economic opportunity in the North, and so began moving to those cities. Black churches began organizing caravans of Black citizens leaving the South and going to the North and the West. Moved from the rural South to many northern cities, specifically or particularly Detroit, Pittsburgh, New York, Chicago. The living conditions weren't good there, but they were so much better than the South. And the Black people were able to escape the repressive laws and terror. And the economic opportunity at that time, at the start of the Great Migration, was significant because pay in those northern cities averaged 3 times what was available even within the best paying jobs in the South. Then in 1898, the cotton crop was badly damaged by the boll weevil. And so even those former slaves, Black citizens working the cotton crops, had less opportunity because cotton was decimated by the boll weevil. So at the time of the beginning of the Great Migration, of course, it's around the time of World War I, and there's a labor shortage in these northern cities. As it turned out, Between 1871 and 1915, the United States had allowed the immigration of 25 million European people. So 25 million European immigrants into the United States between 1871 and 1915. But with the war, immigration came to a screeching halt. And of course, you had the white men who were now serving in the armed forces and were away at war. So their jobs were not being filled. Then you had increased war production that meant that there was an even greater demand for workers. And so the opportunity for Blacks living in the South were huge by comparison. But eventually, when World War I came to an end, war production stopped, the white service members came home, there was a labor surplus. At the time, Black workers were not allowed to join unions, and so the protections all applied to the white workers. And this led to a tremendous amount of racial tension in these cities. Even more striking to me were the lynchings of Black servicemen in uniform. These were African-American US citizens who had fought for our country in World War I, survived, and came home proudly wearing their uniforms. But the specter of a Black man wearing a US military uniform was inflammatory to many white citizens. And there were a not insignificant number of cases where Black servicemen were lynched in uniform. There was a particular case of the Dorseys. It was two couples. They were out for a ride, and the two men were in uniform. They were ambushed by a group of whites and murdered. The wife of one of the servicemen was 7 months pregnant, and the attackers cut out the fetus and stomped it to death, all because they were so incensed at a Black man wearing a US military uniform. Imagine. Well, there were a huge number of race riots in 1917 in East St. Louis, the city you recall that John Hartfield fled to try to establish some economic stability and bring the woman he loved back to live with him. And 1919 was known as the Red Summer, when there were 25 race riots in Chicago. Chicago's was the most extreme, but 25 other cities. And so the Great Migration had tremendous demographic effects on the cities of the North. And the result of the Great Migration resounds to this day. And we'll be talking more about what happened next when we get to class number 3. One of the most telling incidents of race violence, this was in Greenwood, which was an outskirt of Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was known at the time as the Black Wall Street. This was 1921. It was a thriving metropolis of nationally renowned lawyers and doctors, judges, a wealthy community with arts programs, a flourishing community that engendered envy or anger among the white citizens of Tulsa. In 1919, there actually was a lynching of a Black man in Tulsa. And so here we are 2 years later in 1921, and the area is still on edge. Well, on May 31st, 1921, Dick Rowland was a young shoeshine boy who worked in Tulsa, and he needed a break to go to the bathroom. There was one building in the entire city of Tulsa where a Black person could use the restroom. So that's where he went. It was on the 6th floor, so he got on the elevator where a young white woman named Sarah Page was the elevator operator. Something happened. It wasn't known at the time exactly what. It's been reconstructed that he likely bumped into her or stepped on her foot, but she screamed and they both ran. And Dick Rowland was apprehended by the police, and the Tulsa Tribune ran an article about his assault on Sarah Page and incited the white citizens to attack him as he was being held in the city building in the jail. Because there had been a lynching 2 years before, a number of Black men from Greenwood came and surrounded the building where Dick Rowland was being held, hoping to forestall yet another lynching. But shots were fired and a riot ensued. At the end of 3 days, it's believed that more than 300 Black citizens were killed. You see a photograph here of Greenwood. The entire city was demolished. 10,000 people left homeless. They were rounded up and taken to a civic center where they were held in varying amounts of time from days to weeks before they were released. When it came time to decide what to do about the Greenwood area, the residents were hoping it would be rebuilt, but the city determined that turning Black Wall Street area into an industrial community would serve as a further buffer between the white residents of Tulsa and the poorer Black community of Blacks who lived on the other side of the former Greenwood community. What's even more telling about this is how it was kept a secret. The pastor of my church grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was a boy there, actually lived there through his graduation from college. He's currently about 70. And he didn't learn about Greenwood until he was in his 50s. Nobody talked about it. If you go to the Tulsa Tribune offices, you will find preserved there the front page of every paper published, every edition, except the one on May 31st that called for action against Dick Rowland. Most recently, the TV show Watchmen covered this circumstance. And in fact, the mayor of Tulsa has just authorized the excavation of 2 parts of the city where it is believed that there may be mass graves from the Greenwood massacre. It was, for years, it was, when it was made known, it was called the Greenwood Race Riot. It was not a race riot. It was a race massacre and kept a secret. So as we come to the end of this class, if you're watching this in a group, you might want to consider talking about these discussion questions. If you're watching it by yourself, I would ask you to reflect on them and maybe have conversations with other people at other times. What did you learn that surprises you? And what do you observe today, looking around our communities, our country, that is a legacy of convict leasing, that is a legacy of Jim Crow segregation, that is a legacy of a terror lynching that went on for decades, and it could be argued continues to this day. I look forward to seeing you again for part 3 of our series, which will be public policy and the civil rights movement. Thank you.